The wind came down from the high ridge, sweeping dust across the main street of Red Hollow, a town that looked half-built and half-forgotten. Boards creaked on the saloon porch. A dog barked at nothing, and by the hitching post outside the stage depot stood Grant McCall, boots planted in the grit, hat brim low, eyes steady as stone. He'd been up since dawn, washed, shaved, and even worn the dark coat he saved for Sunday. The men at the livery teased him for it, but he'd ignored them. Today was meant to be a beginning. The mail-order bride he'd been corresponding with for 3 months, Miss Margaret Finch of St. Louis, was due on the coach. He'd spent long evenings writing those letters, every word measured, every promise plain. A man didn't need poetry, just honesty. He'd written, "I offer a quiet home, steady work, and my word that I'll treat you fair." That was enough, or so he thought. The noon coach thundered down the ridge trail in a swirl of dust. The driver cracked his whip and the horses slowed before the depot. The door swung open and the first passenger, a traveling salesman, climbed down, brushing dust off his suit. Then came a woman. She stepped onto the street like someone arriving in the wrong story. Her bonnet was plain, her dress travel-stained. A scuffed carpet bag hung from one hand, and a folded paper from the other. Her eyes searched the crowd, hopeful, cautious. When they met Grant, she smiled faintly, as if she recognized something kind in his face. But Grant's brow furrowed. "This wasn't Margaret Finch, Mr. McCall?" she asked softly. He hesitated. "That's me." She let out a breath of relief. "Thank heaven. I feared I'd been put off in the wrong town. My name is Lydia Hart. I believe there's been a mistake." The driver was already tossing luggage down, muttering about schedules. A few townsfolk lingered. Mrs. Daly from the Mercantile, old Tom Beasley with his pipe watching like it was a show. Grant's jaw tightened. "You're not the woman I was expecting." Lydia nodded, clutching her papers. "No, sir. I was bound for Cedar Bluff, not Red Hollow. My coach was robbed 2 days ago, took everything but this." She unfolded a crumpled letter. "The sheriff said the next ride west stopped here and, well, I thought perhaps your name looked familiar on the list of mail order requests." The whispering started at once. Mrs. Daly leaned to her friend. "That's the widow from Kansas way. The one folks say left her husband's grave behind too soon." Grant heard it. So did Lydia. Her chin lifted, though her hands trembled. "I'm sorry for the trouble," she said. "I'll find work and earn my fare to Cedar Bluff soon enough." He should have sent her on. He'd been burned once before by misplaced kindness. But she looked bone-tired, her shoes near worn through, and there was something in her eyes, honest and bruised all at once. "You can rest at my place for the night," Grant said at last, his voice even. "There's room enough in the bunkhouse," Mrs. Daly gasped audibly. "A lady in a ranch bunkhouse?" Grant turned his gaze on her until she hushed. "She's not staying for comfort, ma'am. Just till we sort this mix-up." Lydia's eyes filled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. McCall. I won't be a burden." He nodded once and took her bag, ignoring the stairs following them down the street. The dust rose around their boots, swallowing their silhouettes in the afternoon glare. Behind them, the gossip grew louder, words like widow, improper, pity. Grant didn't look back. By sundown, the McCall ranch stretched before them, rolling pasture, weathered barn, a small white house at the center like a promise he wasn't sure he wanted to keep. When they reached the porch, Lydia paused. "It's a fine place," she said softly. "Hard place," Grant replied. "Fine comes later if you earn it." She nodded, accepting the weight of that truth. Inside, the housekeeper, Mrs. Tillman, froze when she saw the stranger. "Another mouth to feed, Mr. McCall?" she asked sharply. "Just for a few days," he said, Mrs. Tillman's lips pressed thin. "I'll have no part in sheltering women who bring town talk through the door." Grant's temper flickered. "You're paid to run this house, not to judge who walks in." The housekeeper's eyes flashed, then she untied her apron and laid it on the table. "Then you'll be running it yourself." When the door slammed behind her, the house went still. Lydia stood uncertain, the firelight catching the dust in her hair. "I can earn my keep," she said quietly. "If you'll let me." Grant glanced toward the empty doorway, then back at her. For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside, the wind picked up again, whispering through the sage like a warning, or maybe a beginning. The morning sun burned pale over the McCall ranch, throwing long shadows across the corral. A coyote yipped somewhere far off, and the smell of coffee drifted through the open door of the kitchen. Grant sat at the head of his table, coat hung over the chair, trying to read the day's ledger. But the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was uneasy, full of footsteps that didn't belong. Lydia Hart moved carefully through the room, sleeves rolled, her hair pinned up in a simple knot. She'd found flour in the pantry and a skillet by the stove, and now the scent of biscuits filled the air. Grant tried not to notice the difference she made just being there. "You didn't have to cook," he said finally. Voice low but firm. She glanced over, dusting her hands. "I can't eat your food without earning it. Seems fair to bake it first?" He set the ledger down. "You don't owe me anything, Mrs. Hart." Her eyes flicked up. "It's Miss Hart now." She said it without bitterness, just a fact. "And I've learned a woman always owes something one way or another." Grant had no reply for that. Later that morning, he saddled his horse to check the north fence. Lydia stood by the porch rail, mending her skirt with neat, patient stitches. "I'll send a message to Sheriff Hill," Grant said. "He can write Cedar Bluff, see about your situation. Might take a few weeks, but we'll get you home." She nodded, but her voice was small. "I've no home left there, Mr. McCall. My husband's kin made sure of that. After he passed, they said I brought shame. I was only trying to work, honestly." Grant adjusted the reins, uncomfortable with the story pressing between them. "Then what is it you plan to do now?" She gave a small smile. "Start again, I suppose. Same as most folks out here." By noon, the ranch hands had gathered for their meal. 3 rough men who'd worked for Grant since spring. They ate on the porch, passing tin plates and jokes, but when Lydia stepped out with the coffee pot, the laughter dulled. "That her?" whispered one, elbowing the other. "Mail order bride gone astray," the second muttered. Should have known McCall'd have some woman trouble sooner or later. Grant heard them and shot a glare sharp enough to cut. "You got something worth saying, say it loud enough for both of us." The men looked down quickly, muttering apologies. Lydia poured the coffee without meeting anyone's eyes. Her hands didn't tremble, though her jaw was tight. When she turned to go, Grant caught her quietly. "Don't mind them. They talk like fools, but they work honestly." She gave a faint nod. "Men have said worse to me before." I stopped letting it bruise. Something in her tone, calm, but weary, sat heavy with him as he watched her disappear into the house. On that evening, the air turned cool, pink light spilling over the barn roof. Grant found Lydia outside with a washboard by the trough, scrubbing his shirts clean with determined hands. He frowned. "You've done enough for one day." She looked up, soap bubbles streaking her wrists. "I'd rather work than sit and think." He studied her, this woman who didn't fit the picture he'd painted in his head. Margaret Finch would have fainted at the smell of horse sweat, turned her nose up at mended curtains. Lydia Hart, in her worn dress and bare feet, was out here fighting dirt and ghosts with equal resolve. "You said your coach was robbed," he said after a moment. "Are you lose anyone on it?" She shook her head. "No, just my things, letters, photographs. The sort that proves who you are." "You got no proof now?" "Only this." She touched the letter she kept folded in her pocket. "Wrong name, wrong man. Seems fitting." A crow called from the fence post, breaking the silence. Grant cleared his throat. "You can stay a few days longer, until the sheriff hears back." Lydia looked down at the water, her reflection trembling there. "I don't aim to be charity, Mr. McCall." "I don't offer charity," he said, voice steady. "Just fairness." She met his gaze then, steady, searching. "Then I'll earn my bed and board proper. I can cook, clean, mend, or help with stock. You won't regret it, Grant nodded once. We'll see. And that night, when the lamps were low, Lydia lay awake on the narrow bunk in the spare room, listening to the wind hum against the boards. Outside, a coyote cried again, lonely and raw. She closed her eyes and whispered to the dark, "You'll not break me twice." Across the hall, Grant sat by the dying fire, turning her name over in his thoughts. He'd ordered a bride for the sake of convenience. Instead, fate had sent him a reminder that life, like the prairie wind, never delivered what a man asked for, only what he might deserve. The next morning broke clear, with a sky so blue it made the dusty plains almost unbearable in their brightness. Grant rose before dawn, the chill of the early light biting through his shirt. He walked the corral, checking the gates, the fences, the pens where calves huddled. But it wasn't the animals that caught his attention. His gaze kept drifting toward the small cabin where Lydia Hart had already started her day. From the kitchen window, he could see her scrubbing the floor with a brush and hot water, moving with careful efficiency. Her sleeves were rolled high, revealing lean arms dusted with fine hair and a few faint scars, traces of a life that had demanded more than it ought to have. Her hair had fallen loose in places, curling at her neck where the bonnet had slipped, but she didn't pause to fix it. She was already on the next task. He watched her pause only once to tie up a bag of flour for the pantry, and felt an unfamiliar stir of something, respect, or maybe surprise that she had the nerve and the strength to tackle tasks he would have expected a hired hand to shirk. By mid-morning, he found her hauling water from the well to fill the trough. The buckets were heavy, the wood rimmed with frost from the night. Her back was straight, her hands steady, her breath even. He dismounted from his horse without thinking and came closer. "Need a hand?" he asked. She shook her head, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "I can manage, Mr. McCall. I've done heavier work than this." He chuckled softly, more to himself than her, remembering the stories of widows and farm hands she had likely bested in her time. Something about the way she carried herself, the quiet confidence beneath a layer of exhaustion, made him reassess what he had assumed about a woman out here. Inside, she had mended his worn coat and stitched the torn harness. Outside, she fixed the broken fence post by the chicken pen. When he returned from the fields, he saw her knee-deep in mud, hammering stubborn nails with the determination of a man who had been forced to survive too long without help. "You move fast," he said, leaning against the fence. "I have to," she replied without looking up. A day wasted is a day closer to going hungry or being at someone's mercy. Her words made him flinch. He had imagined Margaret Finch arriving in lace gloves, nervous about the smell of livestock, perhaps squeamish at the mud on the floorboards. But here was a woman who embraced hardship, not just endured it. By afternoon, the letter confirming Margaret Finch's continued delay arrived from Cedar Bluff. Grant held it in his hand, staring at the neat handwriting and cold formality. The woman he had been expecting, the bride he had planned for, wouldn't arrive for another week at least. Lydia, carrying a bucket of water to the barn, caught his eye. She paused mid-step. "I'll be going soon," she said quietly, almost apologetically. Grant's chest tightened. "Why? I promised I wouldn't overstay," she replied. "I'm not yours to keep." He felt an edge of frustration rise. He had begun to notice her everywhere, in the clean lines of the kitchen, in the repaired fence that now held strong, in the small ways she anticipated needs before he spoke. Sending her away now seemed foolish. Still, he didn't argue. "We'll see," he muttered, more to himself than her, and rode off to check the south pasture, leaving her to her work. The ranch felt different when he rode away, fuller, livelier. The animals were calm. The wind seemed to carry less dust, and even the sun shone brighter across the yard. Lydia had changed the rhythm of the homestead simply by being present, working harder than anyone could have expected, turning the mundane tasks of ranch life into acts of resilience and quiet grace. That evening, He found her mending the barn roof in the last light, perched on the slats with the confidence of someone who had survived worse than broken boards and creaking rafters. The sky bled orange and pink behind her, and he realized he had begun seeing her not as a mistake, not as a temporary solution, but as someone indispensable. He leaned against the doorway, watching her, aware for the first time that the woman he had assumed was misplaced might actually belong here. At least, more than the bride he had been expecting, and yet, even as he felt the pull of this realization, Lydia's words lingered. "I'll be going soon." "I'm not yours to keep." It was a challenge, quiet but insistent, and for the first time, Grant didn't know whether to stop her or let her prove her independence on her own terms. The sky darkened suddenly, a violent shift that no one in Red Hollow had seen coming. By mid-afternoon, the wind howled through the ranch, tearing at fence posts and rattling the roof shingles. Heavy clouds rolled in like an army of gray horses blotting out the sun. Rain pelted the earth, turning the dry dirt into thick, slippery mud. Grant McCall squinted against the sheets of rain as he rode toward the far pasture. He could see the herd of cattle scattered and panicked, lowing and shoving each other in fright. The storm came too quickly to warn them properly. Lydia was already there, drenched to the skin, sleeves rolled up, her boots caked with mud as she drove the animals toward the safety of the corral. Grant's voice cut through the rain. "Lydia, go back to the house!" She shook her head. "Not when they're at risk." The next hour was a blur of shouting, slipping, and soaked clothing. Grant and Lydia moved in a rhythm that needed no words, guiding frightened animals, riding overturned carts, and latching gates against the storm's fury. Thunder split the sky like a rifle shot, and lightning danced across the horizon, illuminating her face for a fleeting second, determined, brave, unyielding. At one point, a young calf slipped into the muddy riverbank, and Lydia didn't hesitate. She plunged in after it, her dress clinging to her, boots soaked, hair plastered to her cheeks. Grant rushed to help, gripping her arm to steady her as she lifted the trembling animal. Neither cared about themselves, only about the life they saved. By nightfall, the storm had passed as abruptly as it had arrived. They stood soaked, exhausted, mud-streaked across their faces and clothing. The corral was secure, the cattle safe, and the ranch, though battered, had survived. Inside the warm kitchen, Lydia wrung out her hair and sleeves, the fire casting a soft glow on her face. She finally sank into a chair, relief and fatigue etched in every line. Grant stood silently, letting the quiet stretch between them. He hadn't realized how much he had relied on her strength and calm under pressure until now. She looked up at him, a shadow of a smile on her lips. "You expected Margaret Finch, didn't you? Elegant, polite, maybe faint at the first hint of mud?" He swallowed hard. The words caught in his throat. I expected someone else," she nodded. "So did I, in a way. But the woman before you now? Well, she's no one you ordered. Just someone who's trying to live honestly as best she can." Grant felt something stir deep in his chest, a mix of admiration and something softer, something he hadn't anticipated. The woman before him had faced loss, hardship, and scorn, and yet she moved through the world with dignity and courage. "You lost someone once," he said carefully. "I can see it in your eyes." Her gaze dropped to her hands, still trembling slightly from the cold and exertion. "My husband. He died 2 years ago. I tried to live as I ought, but everyone around me decided I had done wrong, even though I only defended myself from a cruel man who would have destroyed me." Her voice caught briefly, but she held it steady. "I've spent a long time carrying the judgment of others." Grant felt a pang of sorrow, but also a rising respect. She wasn't fragile nor bitter. She was resilient, steadfast, and fiercely honest. And now, after this storm, he could see it clearly. This was not a woman in need of rescue. She was someone who could stand by him as an equal. For the first time, he imagined a life not defined by the letters he had sent or the bride he had expected, but by the woman who had worked through mud, rain, and hardship to prove her worth simply by being herself. Maybe the woman I wanted isn't the woman I need, he said quietly, almost to himself. Lydia's eyes met his, searching, as if she knew what he meant without him saying more. For a moment the house seemed warmer, the fire brighter, and the air between them charged with unspoken understanding. Outside the rain still fell in drizzles, washing the dust from the ranch, leaving it fresh and new. And inside, Grant realized something that he could not yet voice aloud. He was beginning to see Lydia Hart as more than a mistake, a companion, a partner. Maybe even something closer to the heart he thought was long closed. The next morning arrived with an unexpected clarity, the air crisp and clean after the storm. Birds returned cautiously, singing over puddles that glistened in the sunlight. For a brief moment, Grant thought life could return to its quiet rhythm, until the sound of carriage wheels clattering across the wooden planks of Red Hollow's main street shattered that calm. The real bride had arrived, Margaret. Finch stepped down from the polished carriage, elegant and composed, a vision straight from the letters Grant had cherished. Her gown was spotless, embroidered with fine threads, the hem never brushing the dusty ground. Her gloves were white, her posture precise, and her gaze swept across the ranch like a woman entering a foreign world she had already decided was beneath her. Grant dismounted slowly, his hands tightening around the reins. "Margaret," he said, voice steady though his stomach nodded. She curtsied, all formal grace. "Mr. McCall," she said, the tone polite but distant, as though she were addressing a stranger who had inconvenienced her by existing. Then her eyes fell on Lydia, who was gathering the last of the firewood, mud streaking her dress and hands raw from the chores she had completed. Margaret's delicate lips tightened. "And who is this?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. Grant glanced at Lydia, unsure if he should intervene. Lydia met Margaret's stare with calm dignity, folding her hands in front of her. "I am Lydia Hart, ma'am. I was stranded by the storm. Mr. McCall allowed me to stay until arrangements could be made." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Allowed you? My goodness, such rustic manners." She looked down at Lydia's calloused hands and muddy skirts. "Is this how you treat the company in Red Hollow? Filth and labor?" Lydia said nothing, only bowed her head respectfully. Grant felt a tension coil in his chest. Here was the woman he had ordered, perfect on paper, but cold, aloof, and entirely unsuited for the life he lived. And here, in contrast, was Lydia, muddy and worn, but steady and dependable, having earned every corner of this ranch with her hands and heart. Margaret sniffed, brushing dust from her gown with gloved hands. "I had hoped for more. Refinement." She gestured at the floors, the animals, the very walls of the house. "It's all so crude." Grant's jaw tightened. Something inside him stirred, a protective, fiery insistence he didn't expect. "This isn't a ballroom, Margaret. It's a working ranch. And the woman before you," he said, glancing at Lydia, "knows how to keep it running." Margaret's lips pressed thin, her eyes flashing with a mix of indignation and disbelief. "You expect me to live like this? To work in dirt, to cook and clean for hours like some peasant?" Grant shook his head slowly, feeling the pull of reality against his old expectations. He had written letters about quiet evenings and measured companionship, but he had never imagined that the woman he wanted on paper would recoil from the truth of life on the land, that she would crumble under its demands while Lydia, the unexpected guest, had thrived. Lydia's gaze met his calm and unwavering. No pride, no pleading, just honesty and dignity, and Grant realized that every small act she had done, the mending, the feeding, the saving of his cattle, had quietly built a bridge between them. A bridge Margaret Finch could never cross. Margaret made a sharp, dismissive sound and turned toward the carriage. "Perhaps I've made a mistake." Grant felt the weight of a choice pressing down on him. Here was duty, order, and the expectations of letters and arrangements. And here was the woman who had shown him something real, something earned through sweat, courage, and honesty. He couldn't pretend the feelings stirring in his chest were wrong. The warmth in his heart, the relief in his chest after days of storm and labor all pointed to the same truth. Grant took a deep breath. "I'll not pretend what I ordered means more than what's before me," he said firmly. Margaret looked startled, and Lydia's eyes widened slightly, not with surprise, but with hope. The ranch, once quiet and orderly, felt electric with tension. Outside, the animals grazed calmly, unaware of the silent battle being waged inside the house. Inside, Grant's gaze settled on Lydia, and for the first time he saw not just a mistaken arrival, but the woman he might truly need. Margaret Finch, for all her elegance, would never fit this life. And for the first time, he realized it was a life he wanted to share with someone who had earned it, someone who had already chosen him through action rather than arrangement. The morning sun barely warmed the McCall ranch, and already tension hummed through the air like an electric wire. Margaret Finch had made her displeasure known the previous evening, pacing the parlor, muttering about unsuitable accommodations and lowly service. Lydia, for all her patience, had remained quiet, finishing her chores without complaint, her movements precise but heavy with exhaustion. But the true crisis came when Margaret crossed the line. "You've deceived him, haven't you?" Margaret demanded in a haughty voice, standing rigidly in the doorway of the kitchen. Her gloves were pristine, her expression sharpened like a knife. "All this pretending you belong here, working in the dirt, earning his trust. You've made him feel something." "Something he shouldn't, and for what? Shelter? A place to hide from your past?" Lydia froze, hands still on the skillet she had just set down. Her chest tightened, and for a brief moment, the weight of old shame, the stories whispered in other towns, the judgment of strangers, pressed down as if it had followed her from Kansas to Red Hollow. "I haven't deceived anyone," Lydia said quietly, meeting Margaret's cold gaze with a courage born of years surviving harsh judgments. "I've done my work and I've lived honestly. I have nothing to hide." Margaret's laugh was sharp, brittle, and filled with venom. "Honest, is that what you call this? You've inserted yourself into his home, his life, making him question what he wrote letters for, making him doubt the woman he expected. You're a fraud." Grant had been walking toward the barn when the voices reached him. He turned sharply, seeing the scene unfold in the doorway. His heart clenched. Margaret's words were precise, cruel, and Lydia's calm defiance only made them sting harder. He strode into the room, voice firm. "Margaret, that's enough." But Margaret ignored him, continuing to berate Lydia. "I should have brought the law with me. You'll not ruin a man's reputation with your lies and claims of virtue." Lydia's lips pressed together, but she said nothing further. Her eyes were downcast and her shoulders straight, bearing the weight of words meant to wound. The years of whispered rumors and accusations she had endured seemed to converge in that moment, and it became too much. Before Grant could step closer, Lydia turned quietly, lifting her skirts just enough to navigate the muddy floor and walk toward the door. "I'll not stay where I'm unwanted," she said softly, but with unshakable resolve. "I won't be the cause of someone else's harm. You may defend me, but I'll leave of my own accord." And with that she vanished into the morning light, leaving the door swinging in her wake. The ranch, once alive with movement and work, felt hollow. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and charred bread. The floorboards creaked under the emptiness, the wind whistling through the open door like a mournful echo of her absence. Grant stood frozen, watching the space she had occupied, realizing too late that her silence and composure had been stronger than Margaret's words, stronger than the chaos around them. The very air seemed to mourn her departure. The cows stood quietly in the corral, ears twitching. The barn doors banged gently in the breeze. Even the fire in the hearth hissed and popped like it grieved the loss of warmth and presence. He felt the full weight of the choice he hadn't fully grasped. He could follow duty, social expectation, and the arrangement he had originally made with Margaret Finch, or he could admit, painfully, that he had been blind to the woman who had quietly become indispensable. who had earned his respect and his heart. But Lydia was already gone, moving down the trail toward the river crossing where the mail stage might carry her further from Red Hollow. She walked with quiet dignity, but Grant could see the strain in her gait, the exhaustion pressing down on every step. For a long moment, he simply watched, frozen by regret and helplessness, realizing the depth of what he had risked losing. And in that still empty house, he understood a truth that had been forming for weeks. The ranch, the life he had known, and even the bride he had ordered meant nothing compared to the woman who had quietly saved it all, and his heart, without ever asking for anything in return. The crisis had come, raw and painful, and now it was a matter of whether he could act before it was too late. The storm that had passed days before returned in a new form. The river swelled from unexpected rains upstream, carrying logs and debris in a surging, churning flow. Grant McCall rode hard, the wind cutting through his coat, mud splattering across his boots and trousers. Every second he delayed was another second Lydia Hart might slip beyond his reach. A neighbor, old Tom Beasley, had spotted her struggling to cross a makeshift plank at the river's edge and had come running, shouting her location over the roar of the water. Grant's heart hammered in his chest as he urged his horse faster, the familiar rhythm of hooves pounding against the earth matching his rising panic. He had chased cattle through storms, battled fences collapsing in wind, and faced fires threatening his barns, but nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for the thought of losing Lydia, the woman who had quietly rebuilt the rhythm of his ranch and the warmth of his home, the woman who had revealed more honor and courage in a single week than any bride he had ever imagined. The river came into view, a wall of brown water sweeping against the banks. Lydia's figure appeared, balancing on the narrow, unstable plank, hands gripping a sapling branch to keep steady. Mud streaked her face and soaked her skirts, but she moved with unwavering determination. Even in danger, she showed no panic, only focus, only resolve. "Lydia!" Grant shouted, voice cutting across the wind. She glanced up, eyes wide for the briefest moment, and then returned to her careful steps. He slid off his horse, plunging into the shallow but fast-moving edge, boots sinking into the mud. The water tugged at his legs, threatening to pull him off balance, but he fought forward. His heart raced, not with fear of the river, but fear of the moment when he might lose her. Halfway across, a loose plank wobbled beneath Lydia's feet, sending a spray of water upward. She slipped, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to pause. Grant lunged, gripping her hand, pulling her toward him with all the strength in his arms. She caught her balance, breathing hard, mud streaking her face like war paint. "You shouldn't have come," she gasped. "I'd risk worse than this to keep you from walking away," he said, voice fierce. "You're not just a mistake, Lydia. You're the woman I need." Her gaze held his, searching, and for the first time a flicker of hope lit in her eyes. Slowly, she allowed herself to be guided safely back to solid ground, her hands trembling slightly, not from the river, but from the enormity of what had just passed between them. Grant led her back toward the ranch, dripping wet, exhausted, but alive with a new energy that neither could deny. "I've canceled the arrangement with Margaret Finch," he said quietly. "I no longer want what I ordered. I want this. You. Only you." Lydia stopped, water dripping from her sleeves, and looked up at him. For a long moment silence passed between them, filled only by the river's roar and the whispering wind through the trees. Then she spoke, voice soft, steady, full of the same courage that had guided her through storms, mud, and judgment. "You mean it?" she asked. Grant nodded. "I've made mistakes before, but not this time. You weren't the bride I expected, but you're the woman I need." Her lips curved into a smile, muddy and imperfect, but radiant with relief and warmth. The tension, the fear, the weeks of uncertainty melted into that single truth, the truth that they had both been waiting for without fully realizing it. They walked back together, side by side, the ranch stretching before them like a promise finally understood. For the first time in years, the homestead felt complete. not because of contracts or arrangements, but because two hearts had chosen each other despite circumstance, expectation, and past wounds. The sun broke through the clouds, light glinting off the wet grass and the river beyond. It was no longer a world of mistakes or missteps. It was a world of possibilities, hard-earned and real, where work, trust, and courage could form the foundation of something far stronger than any letter could dictate. Grant offered Lydia his hand, and she took it without hesitation. Together they walked across the ranch, through the mud, past the fences she had mended, past the barn she had helped secure, into a future that neither of them had ordered, but both of them had earned. Weeks had passed since the river incident, and the McCall ranch had settled into a rhythm that was almost musical in its simplicity. The animals moved freely and contentedly. The fences stood firm, and the house, once quiet and empty, now hummed with warmth and laughter. Lydia Hart moved through the homestead with a natural grace that had grown from months of hard work and shared toil. She baked bread in the early morning, the smell drifting through the house and out into the yard, mingling with the earthy scent of hay and mud. Her hands were calloused, her skirts dust-streaked, but there was a glow about her that came not from elegance or polish, but from belonging. Grant watched her from the porch, arms crossed over his chest, sunlight catching the lines of his weathered face. He had learned to measure a day not by letters or contracts, but by shared glances. The easy laughter echoing across the corral and the small, unspoken ways they had come to rely on each other. "Morning," he called, tipping his hat as she carried a basket of eggs from the henhouse. "Morning," she replied, smile bright despite the dirt streaking her cheeks. "You didn't chase any stray calves today?" "Only two," he said, chuckling, and she shook her head, mock exasperation in her gaze. Their hands brushed as she set the basket on the table, and neither pulled away. It was a small, silent acknowledgement of the bond that had grown from hardship, honesty, and shared labor. A bond far deeper than any arrangement or expectation. Outside, the ranch spread out like a living tapestry, the fields golden in late summer, the barn doors open, and the animals moving with a calm certainty. They had rebuilt this place together, not just from the aftermath of storms or lost brides, but from trust, resilience, and choice. Grant found himself standing beside Lydia at the fence later that afternoon, watching the cattle graze. "You've done more than I could have ever expected," he said quietly. She glanced at him, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "I only did what I could. You let me stay and I worked. That's all." He shook his head, a slow smile forming. "It's more than that. You've brought life back here. You've brought it back to me." The sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light across the ranch. The wind softened, whispering through the sage and the tall grasses, carrying with it the quiet promise of enduring companionship. Later, as the lamps were lit and supper prepared, Grant and Lydia sat together at the table, the housekeeper's old apron long gone, replaced by a sense of mutual respect and partnership. The meals were shared, the chores divided, and the conversation flowed easily. The awkwardness of their first days now a distant memory. Their evenings were no longer lonely, filled with quiet talks, laughter at minor mishaps, and the comfort of two hearts that had chosen each other freely. The papers that once dictated their lives, the letters, the arrangements, the mistaken expectations, lay forgotten in a drawer. They were unnecessary now, replaced by trust, understanding, and love forged in the soil and sweat of the ranch. Grant took Lydia's hand as they stepped outside to watch the sun sink behind the ridges. "You weren't the bride I ordered," he said softly, voice carrying in the still air. She smiled, eyes bright, hands firm in his. "No," she replied, "but I think we both found exactly what we needed." And so the McCall Ranch thrived, not just as a home or a livelihood, but as a sanctuary shaped by patience, resilience, and two people who had chosen honesty and strength over appearances. The wind whispered through the open fields, carrying the quiet laughter and footsteps of two hearts that had survived storms, both of nature and of circumstance, and had found in each other something far richer than what they had ever expected. Here, in the golden light of late afternoon, with the animals grazing peacefully and the house warm with life, Grant and Lydia stood side by side, not by contract, not by accident, but by choice, finally whole, finally home. If you loved watching Grant and Lydia's story unfold, hit like and subscribe for more heartfelt Wild West tales. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a story of love, courage, and unexpected beginnings.